All right, so I'm in my project folder. I open my project folder in VS Code. I'm creating an index file and index.html. I just bring in my boilerplate for HTML, then I am going to give it CSS lesson. So let me make it CSS lesson, and then I'm going to create another file, and then I'm going to call it style.css, and that is it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my, let me create an element over here, paragraph, and bring in a dummy text. All right, let me do this. Let me open the live server, and let me bring the live server from here. All right, the usual ritual. Let me position them side by side. Close this. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this P and give it a style P, and I'm going to say color. Then I'm going to give it a value of red. Then save. And by virtue of the fact that we're using live server, it's supposed to work to refresh automatically. But I've refreshed manually and it's still happening. But I have my style sheet and I have my index it's .html file in the same project folder, and it's not affecting it. Something is wrong. And it's because they are two different documents. And so if you have two different documents and you want what's in one document to apply to the other, then you have to link those two documents. And so what you can do here is come to what link, right? And we go to link, then we define what the relationship, right? We are linking a document to what our HTML document. So first of all, we are going to define the relationship. How is that document coming to relate to our index.html file? And that's going to be what a style sheet, right? Because that particular document is coming to style our element. Then we will define another property, which is what the href or the hyperreference. And where is that? That's it's simply saying where is that file. And so href, and we are going to give it what style.css, and you can see that our VS Code is helping us out. Now there is a third attribute which previously was required, which is what the type attribute. And what the type attribute takes is what text slash css, right? And after I have saved it, you realize that the style which I have defined in my CSS has been applied to the text. However, this type equals text slash CSS is not required in modern day HTML. So you can just put in link rel equals style sheet, href equals style.css, and everything is going to work right. And so there's no need to bring that. You don't have to bring it. I just thought you should know that there is something like that. And so that is it about linking your document to a CSS file. All right. So let's go ahead and let's do a few other things. Let me bring an H1 and say I am learning CSS, right? And I have the H1 title showing over there for me. Great. So there are a few things which we should be looking at in CSS, and as you can see over here, I have three key things over here. I have the P, I have the color, and then I have what red. Are you getting it? So this is what the P over here. Let me bring this down. The P over here is what we call the element that you want to style, right? So that's the P, and then we have what the color. That is the attribute which you are declaring or the property. Then the red becomes what the value which you are assigning to the property. Are you getting it? So we can say a human being, which is what the element, right? Then you can say something like human. Um, There is nothing like human in HTML, but I just want to use to give an example. Human, and then what property about the human do you want to define? Let's say height, right? And then the height of the human being is let's say 1.6 meters, right? 1.6 meters, and we have it. So it's the element or the item you want to style, the property, and then the value. So basically, that's what we are going to be doing in styling, and that and more, right? So the next thing I would like us to look at is what we call the cascade. Next thing I would like us to look at is what we call the cascade. And as you know, if you don't, CSS means cascading style sheet. And how is styles applied to um, first before I move on to cascade. Before I move on to cascade, let me just look at this. All right, so there are three ways by which we can style elements. And one of them is what we are already doing by adding an external style sheet. So we are adding a style, or we are linking to a style which is defined in a different file. The style is in a different file and we are linking to it just as we've done. Another way by which you can style your element is by using what? On-page styling, all right? And the on-page styling inside your head element, you should be, uh, you should pay attention to this side. You don't bring your style element after the heading. It shouldn't be a sibling of the heading. It should be what a child of the heading. So it should be inside the heading. And then whatever styles you want to apply, you apply it over here. So I can just bring in my selector, which is the P, and then I bring my curly braces, right? Then I can see color, and I can see Rebecca purple, and let me save. And you realize that let me just zoom this in a little bit. You realize that the text color has changed. So this is what on page styling, on page styling, or internal styling, as some may call it. Then the very first one we have is called external styling or external style sheet. External style sheet. And these two forms of styling, none of them have precedence over the other. What matters is the cascade or the order in which they are defined, right? So this is another file. This is here. The browser is not going to read the two as what another file. Um, the browser is not going to read the two as what another file. Are you getting it? It's going to look bring this in. Everything over there is going to be displayed here, and then this, and this is taking precedence over the red because this one happens first. Are you getting it? This the red styling, which is over here, the browser reads that first. Then it comes to read these. So since this is the last property, the last value for that particular property on this element, then that particular property or that value is going to be applied on that element. And so if I should come up and cut this and bring this here and save, you'd realize that the red is now taking precedence because the browser reads this first and then it comes to read this. So this the red now has precedence, or let's say higher priority over the Rebecca purple. It's like you have a black sheet of paper and then you put a brown sheet of paper on top. People are only going to see the brown sheet of paper. All right. So that's basically what we will talk about the cascade, and it's simply about the order of styling. Now, the next way of styling is what we call the inline styling, and it's not recommended to go in for this option. That way, what you're going to do is you are going to what define a style attribute inside the element you want to style. So I have my style. Then I am now going to declare the property I want to style and say color, right? Then I can say give the color. Let me give it blue, right? Blue, and that one now takes precedence over all of them because inline styling, you realize that it's even coming last, right? So it's gonna take precedence over all of them. When you define an inline style and you define a conflicting style in an external style sheet or an internal style sheet, the inline style will override all other values because that's the last and that's the closest to the element. So you should keep that in mind. And it's not good to actually bring inline styles. If you want to style, you can define an attribute like a class, which you call the class in your style, and then you style it. That way, it's going to apply to all the styles. And the reason it's not advised is that it's going to make you write a lot of code. Suppose we have another paragraph, right? And we say if you realize that that paragraph is something affected by this blue, meanwhile we want all our paragraphs to be affected by what the blue, right? Let me just comment out this styles we have over here. Let me comment this out, and this is the blue is not affecting this style because the style we have applied here, it's affecting only the this particular element, all right. And so if we want blue, we have to bring whatever we have here and put it here again, which makes your code very lengthy. It's however advisable to write what we call a dry code. And dry code means that your code should be dry, not as in literal dry, but what that means is do not repeat yourself or don't repeat yourself. Are you getting it? So if you can do it one time and have as much effect as doing it two or three times, then do it once. Say you are going to your room, you can pick your school bag and then your laptop at a go. There is absolutely no need in you taking your school bag and then coming back to take the laptop, right? Unless it's not possible to do it that way, then you can do it multiple times. But as much as it is possible, you do it once, all right? So say we want to, let me take this off over here, right? And then we want to apply this style of Rebecca Purple to all our properties, right? When I say if you realize that both paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, let me bring a horizontal rule over here just in case you're missing it. You realize that paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 have the same color. Meanwhile, I've written just one line of what? Of code. Then I can come and bring in a third paragraph, right? And then let me bring my horizontal rule again. And then when I scroll down, the third paragraph has the same thing again. So I've just written one line of what of code to define the property, and it's affecting everything else. I'm not repeating myself. That's very great. For the sake of this tutorial and for standardized reasons, we are going to be going with the external style sheet. It's only the only instance where you would want to rely on internal styling is when you're building just a simple piece of a web page and it doesn't have too many elements. Because suppose you're writing a code and then you get to the very bottom, maybe you are on your thousandth line, and then you have to scroll up again and come and style a particular element and go down. There's that back and forth, which is going to affect productivity. And so you would want to have your external style, so you just switch over and switch over. So we're going to be using external style sheet for the rest of this lesson. We're done with the very first part of today's lesson. Anybody having any question, any doubts they need to clear? I assume no questions. So we shall proceed. The next thing we are going to be looking at. So remember, we talked about one thing, and it's called what? The cascade. That is the order in which properties are assigned. The next thing we are going to be looking at is CSS selectors, right? We are going to look at CSS selectors. And let me bring in my H1 again. I shouldn't have taken that out. This is a heading. Then I'm going to, before I do that, let me define a section, right? So a section and bring my H1. Then inside my H1, I'm going to bring a horizontal row. Then after the horizontal, sorry, the H1 is not inside the horizontal row, it's after, so they are siblings. And then from there, I'm going to now bring my paragraph, and as usual, I'm going to bring my dummy text. So I have my dummy text. Let me zoom out a little bit. This is okay. All right. So now let me apply a style, a class, sorry, and give it title. Then let me apply a class and give it what description. Let me say introduction. Yeah, this should make more sense. Introduction. Then let's have another paragraph again. And this time, let's give this a style of um, paragraph 1. Hold on, expected. No, there is something wrong somewhere. No, okay, no, this is supposed to be a class. All right. So I'm giving it a class of paragraph 1. And then let me give this an ID of P1. And then let me give this an ID of P1. And I'm getting an error. Says what? It says the ID value P1 must be unique, which means I think we looked at this yesterday, which means that in on a single web page, a particular ID shouldn't be picked. So the moment you use one ID, you shouldn't use the same ID for another element on that same page again. All right, so now I'm going into, we are looking at what CSS selectors, and there are several ways by which you can select elements, right? The very first way is by selecting the element or the name of the element. And as you can see over here, I've what selected the paragraph element and applied a color of red to the paragraph element. What I can also do, the paragraph, I'm supposed to bring an H here. What I can also do is what bring in a class, right? So I can say H1, which is also another element selector, and then I will say font family, and I'll give it a font family of cursive, and it's going to pick any cursive font, or let me give it a font family of Korean New. All right, so I have a font family of Korean New for my heading. So these are what selecting elements. The next type of selector we can use is what the title. And if you want to select by class, we just bring in dot, then we type the name of the class, right? So we brought a class. The name of the class is title, right? So we can say title. Then we want to give it a color of brown, and you realize that now the color of brown is applied to the heading. It's not applied to the H1 element, it's applied to any element that has what a class of title in it. The same way, if I should have another element over here, let me say an H2, then this is a sub heading. When I scroll down, I'm bringing this line break so that I can see the very bottom of my page. This extension is trying to be a problem. So this is what a subheading. All right. If I should add that particular class of title to this subheading, Let me do that and let's see what happens. Title. You realize that the style and the color of brown is applied to the subtitle as well because it contains the same class. All right. And so when you are styling with a class, because multiple elements can use the same class on a web page, you select them and then you apply the styling which is supposed to be applied to all of them, and it's going to apply to any element that has that particular value, or let's say that class value. I believe I'm making sense and I'm not confusing anybody. If I am, kindly prompt me. So that's one another way of selecting uh, an element. Right. So we look at elements, we look at classes, and the next one is what, an ID. All right. And by if you want to select an object with an ID, you use the pound sign or the hash, as we usually call it here in Ghana. So you can see that paragraph one, I've given it an ID of P1, right? And so I can say pound P1, open my braces. Then I can say color. So let me not give it a color, but I can say font style and give it italics, right? And you can see that the italics has been applied to my font, sorry, the element, which is the paragraph. All right, so that's it about the ID. This is one way of styling or selecting an element. This is another, using the name of the element, using the class property, using the ID property, right? And then basically, these are the three ways we typically select an element. And when it comes to styling, we usually don't go with IDs. All right, we usually go with classes to do the styling. You can still use the ID, and it's not going to give you a problem. However, we usually go for IDs when we want to work. This is not like a strict rule, right? But that's what's mostly done when you're working in JavaScript and you want to select a particular property or a particular element. And you're selecting that element alone. You can we mostly rely on IDs. You can still select classes for you can still select elements using classes or their name properties in JavaScript. We'll do a lot more when we get there. And another way by which you can select a particular element is by selecting the name of the element together with what, a property and a value. Let's see what I mean. You realize, let me bring a form input. I think that is the typical thing. Input and type equals what, text. And then let me save. Let me cut this thing off. All right, so you can see I have my input element showing over there. Let me bring a look more, a few more line breaks. All right, so you can see my input element over there, which is a text input. All right, then I can have another input. Input type equals email. All right, and let me bring just a line break over here to separate them. All right, so I have an input type of what? Of text, and an input type of email. And as you can see, they are looking similar. There is no difference in their appearance, all right? And so I can come here and then select what? The element, which is what, the input. Then I can say width, give it a width property of 100%. Then I can give it a height of 20 pixels. Let me see if I think that's, let me give it a width property of 50% for it to look nice for now. And I'm going to explain, we'll be looking at those pixels and values later. Then let me give it a border radius, of 15 pixels. All right, 15 is too much. Let me make it just 5. Yeah, this looks great. All right, so you can see that both of these elements are having the same style, and because they are having the same names over here. right? So what I can do is what say input, all right, and then bring the square braces and say type equals text, all right. And then what's going to happen is that I'm going to the styling I'm going to do over here will apply to an input element that has what an attribute. Sorry, that has a value of text for its type attribute. All right. So when I come here and I say border 1 pixel solid red, save, we realize that the border is applied, the border property which I have defined over here is now applied to only the input that has what? The type of text. So this is another thing you can do. Suppose you have a lot of inputs and based on your visual structure of your document or whatever you're doing, they all have the same classes. This is another thing you can do. I've never tried this style, this way of selecting elements on any other property. All right, on any other property. But when you want to go with the ID in an instance where you have what, let's say class. All right, let's say class is name. All right, you don't have to come and put class. Let's say come and say class. Class equals name, and it's working for it. All right, the class equals name is working for it because an input that has a property of class which has a value of name is going to work for it. But there is a better way of what doing this. That is when you are dealing with classes and IDs. So you can just go with input dot name. All right. Then you can say border 2px solid purple. All right, and you realize that it's applied to it as well. So instead of doing this, if it's a class or an ID, then you can use the dot or what the pound, right? That is if there is an input that has an ID of name, all right. So let me just do leave this over here. Let me duplicate this, and then come over here, give this email input an ID of EM, or let me make it an ID of email. So remember the email we are going to specify over here. Let me say pounds email. And then let me give it a blue, 1px solid blue, 2px solid blue. I haven't saved. All right, so I've saved. Now it's been applied to it. So the email we are specifying over here is not the type; it is the ID. All right. So instead of saying input ID equals email, you can just put input hash email or input dot name for classes, hash for um, IDs, and you're good to go. So that's basically what there is to know about selectors. If you have class, you bring a dot. If you have an ID, you bring a pound sign or the hash sign. If you want to select the element itself, you just type the name of the element. All right. And then the next thing we are going to be looking at in CSS is called inheritance. All right. And before we move on to inheritance, let me talk about something in the CSS called specificity. All right. There is something in CSS called specificity, and it basically has to do with what order or what elements, what properties have precedence over the other. All right. So back here in my code, I'm going to let me take off one of these. Then let me clear the styling that applies to them. Let me keep the universal styling. All right. So inputs class of let me say class of what user email. Then let me make this email ID. All right. I believe you guys will understand what I'm trying to do over here. So this is a class. This is the input. This is the class. This is the ID, and this is the type. attribute. All right. So over here, you realize that we have a default border radius. Oh, sorry, a default border size which is applied to the element, and then we have given a few properties here on our own. Now these properties apply to the element itself, right? So let's define another border property. Let's say 2px solid red, and it's showing nicely over there, right? Now let's say dot. What's the class we gave over there? User email. Let me just copy and paste. All right. And now let me bring the same property and now change this to Rebecca Pepple. You realize that this is taken away from this. This is overriding this. This styling over here is overriding this. And it's because um, the class has what? A higher specificity than the input, than the element itself. All right. Anytime you're working on a class, it has a anything you apply to the class. Should that particular property coincide with a property assigned on the element itself, the class is going to take precedence. So that is it about the specificity. Then we can also have what an ID. Now, you may say it's because this is coming first, right? When we were talking about the cascade, we saw that whatever comes first will be overridden. But then let's bring our the class to the top, and you realize that even though the class came first, it's still overriding this, and it's because of what? The specificity. It has a higher specificity or a higher priority. You can put it that way, and so that is it. Now, what else has a higher priority than uh, class? And that is what? The ID. So we have an ID of what? Email ID over here, and then let's apply a style to that any element that has that ID, and let's say border is 2px solid and green. All right, green is, and you realize that the ID is now the property that is applied on the ID. It's overriding all of them. Now let's take this over here and see if wow. So the ID has what? The highest priority. No matter where you put it, if an ID is if there is a property that is applied on an ID and there is a coinciding property on the class or the element itself, then the ID is going to what, take precedence. All right. So it's the element, the class, and then the ID. Or let me reverse it. First, the highest priority is the ID. The second highest is the class. The third highest or is what? Or the last is what? The element. And so those are the three things which we're going to be looking at. Now, there is a tool which we call the specificity calculator, and it's going to help you calculate which properties or which elements have a higher priority. Are you getting it? And so let me put the link in the chat section. I'm putting the link in the chat section, and then over here it gives what we have a nav element, and then we have what an anchor in the hover state with a pseudo element before. We'll be looking at pseudo elements and classes later, so you guys shouldn't worry about that. And let me just clean everything over here, and let me bring an hash and say what ID, and you realize that it's giving a specificity score of what 100 or 100. Are you getting it? Now, when I have the class dot class, it's giving what 010. Let me duplicate this and bring the name of the element and say input. All right, it is 001, and so basically that's how it goes. And the specificity it keeps increasing. All right, you may have an element and then have an element with a class, then you have an ID. So let's see. What do we have in our code over here? We have what? An email ID, which is taking the highest priority. All right. So first of all, let me bring my input element over here. And this This calculator says my input has a specificity of what 001, and then let me bring the class over here, and it says we have 010, and then this says let's look at the email ID, and the oh, not saving the page, and this says we have what the higher specificity, which is what 100, which is 100. I like to read it that way. So now let's add a class to this, and let's say dot user email. All right. So now this now has what a specificity of what 011 or 11. Are you getting it? Now let me make it an hash email ID, and it has a specificity of what 101, which is an input with what the input given as one, and then the ID given as the highest priority, which is uh, what do we call it? The highest priority, which is 100. And so, if you want to know what elements, what property is going to take precedence over the other, you can just put your selectors over here, and it's going to calculate it for you. I'll be including the link in the lesson notes. I've added in the chat box if you want to check it out. That's it. So, for the specificity, for CSS specificity, that's what it's about. Now there is another property or attribute, I don't know what to call it, which you can add in your code, and it's going to have the highest priority over the element name, over the ID, over the class, and even over the ID. And that's what the important. Are you getting it? So we know that the element has the lowest specificity, which means any property assigned to the element is going to be overridden by the class or the ID. But let me come here, as the ID is overriding everything, makes the border show green. So when I come here, I can bring what an exclamation sign and write important. Right. Now when I save, you realize that it becomes red. And we usually don't put important in our code, right? When you see it in your code, it gives it kind of feels like you don't really know what you're doing, or you can't look through your code to debug it. So we sometimes, when you want to bring important, when you have a problem in your code and you're debugging is there is something wrong somewhere which you're trying to find and correct. You may bring the important to see what's happening and what's not working. Are you getting it? So we usually don't bring the important inside our CSS. I wouldn't advise that you use it, right? So just try to ignore it as much as possible. When you make mistakes, it helps you to learn and understand the right way to structure your code, right? So we are done with our specificity for now. Anybody having any questions before we proceed on to the next item I have planned for the day? So we looked at the cascade, we looked at selectors, we looked at specificity. All right. So the next thing I would like us to look at is inheritance, right? Inheritance in CSS. And inheritance in CSS is just like we have literal inheritance in real life. If your father owns a property, you're automatically entitled to that property in a way or the other. All right. So coming back to my block of elements over here, I can pick my section. All right. You realize that let me take this particular paragraph out over here. Right. So I'm taking this particular paragraph out of the section. So it's no more a child of the section. It's now becoming a sibling of that section. Then what I can do is give a style to my section and say font family, and make it let's say Franklin Gothic. Let me just bring in that suggestion. All right. And there are some properties that can be inherited. Some properties cannot be inherited. We'll be looking at a few of them. All right. So you realize that the font family property can always be inherited. Section itself doesn't show on the page for the user to use, right? But we have the paragraph element, which is inside the section, and it's taking the property, or it's inheriting that particular property from the parent. All right. Another thing you may also have noticed is that the head in each one is also a child of the same section. However, the heading is not taking that particular value. Why? When we come here, you realize that we've selected our heading and given it what a font family of what Korean new. All right. So though elements take attributes or they inherit attributes or properties from the appearance, you can always overwrite that particular value or the property. That's one thing you should always keep in mind. Suppose I comment this particular line out, you realize that it also takes the same font. So let me bring it out, let me bring it back, and it shows that way. All right. And so anything that is a child of this particular element, if that particular property which we have applied is inheritable, then it's going to inherit it. Are you getting it? So we can also, I can bring, let me bring a small, and then bring another thing over here. And you realize that it's also taking up what? The same font family. It's not taking up the color because the color was applied specifically to what? The title class. No, sorry, not the title class, the paragraph elements. So those ones are showing red. But this is not inheriting the color. Sorry, this is only inheriting the font family because that's what was applied on the pairing. And then another property which can be inherited by elements is the font size. The font size, let's give it a value of 2 rem and see what happens. And the same thing applies what to the small element as well. But it's not applying to this because this is not a child of the same. This it's not a child of the section element. So that's what inheritance is. There are, however, some other properties which are not in. You don't inherit them. All right. For example, if I apply a border property to the section, then I say border, I say 2px solid green. You realize that, let me zoom out my code. Um, let me just take this out for now. You realize that the border is applied over all of them. That is the section itself, right? But it's not affecting the item. So this item is not having a border. This is not having a border. So for the border property, it cannot be inherited. If I want to apply a border to the paragraph, I have to come here and specify the border and say 1px solid blue, and you realize that that particular border has now been applied to my paragraph elements. So we'll be looking at some of them. I'm not going to list what properties can be inherited and what can't, but as we move along, we are going to discover most of them. Anybody having any question, anything which is quite confusing for them? But how many of you are finding the CSX section interesting or beautiful so far? Great. So we'll continue. Did somebody raise their hand? Somebody has their hand raised. Amenyo, kindly ask your question so we can proceed. Amenyo, Amiyo, sorry. Oh, very sorry. Amiyo, you have your hand raised.
Say please about the I didn't really understand the specific. How do you call it? Specificity.
Specificity.
Yeah,
What? Okay. So at what point did you get confused?
like I don't really understand it. I don't understand the whole thing in
Okay. So it's
between.
about hierarchy. Are you getting it? Let me try and see if
Yes.
I can pull up my paint. Great. And so let me say we have this, oh, this, and this. I get it. So, oh, sorry, this is a wrong. Let me bring this here, and let me bring this here, and let me bring this here. Are you getting it?
Yes,
Now,
please.
let's say this is the main element, all right? So let me make it VL. Then this is the class, and this is what the ID, all right? And so let's say something is about to happen to this particular box. Are you getting it? Now these are three different layers. All right. If something is about to happen to this box, which of these layers is going to be affected first, or which of these layers? Let's say you're peeling this particular element, right? Which of these layers can you peel off first? I mean, you can
The first
the
one,
first, which
please.
is what the
Oh, yeah,
element itself. Are you getting it? So you can take this one off first. All right. Then the next one is what? um
the
the
class,
class. Then the last one is what? Is the what?
the ID.
The ID. I get it. Which is
Yes,
simply saying that what? The class is lucky because it's part of the game. Sorry, the element is lucky because it's part of the game. Are you getting it? But the
okay.
class is luckier because the element will die first before the class will die. Are you getting it?
Yes, please.
So let's say the element will be given priority. The element is a lot more important. Sorry, the class is a lot more important than the element itself. Are you getting it? Because you can
Because
have
it's embedded in the class,
because it's
in the
inside the element. The class is inside the
okay.
element.
Yes,
Are you getting it?
yes, please.
Great. Now this is supposed to be a three. Now on the ID, which is the last inside, is the luckiest because if they kill element and they kill class, the last is going to be what ID. Then ID can now come back and do its thing. Are you getting it? So the ID is what the most important, or the it has the highest priority. Are you getting it? So anytime you define one property, let's say you define the property color, all right, on the element itself, and you define it on a class, and you define it on an ID, then the ID is going to what override them. Let me just do that once again. Let me bring different element over here. Let me make it. Let me bring an H1 and says let me call that new heading. Where's my preview? This yeah, right. So I'm having my new heading over here, and this is happening because we've applied a style to all H1 elements. All right. So new heading, and then let me give it a class of what head heading. All right, and let me give it an ID of main underscore heading. I getting it. So when I come here and I apply, let's say, I say H1, and I apply a style of color and I say red, you realize that the H1 will be showing what red. I've selected the element. Are you getting it? Now, when I go back and now I'm selecting what class, all right, and I say dot heading. If you are selecting class, you bring dot. If I say dot heading and then I say color, now I'm applying the same property. If it's a different property, let's say I say font size of 2 rem, then the red is going to stay the same. Are you getting it? And the 2 rem is not making any change because by default headings have a font size of 2 rem. Let me make that 3 rem, and it's showing over here. Since this is a different property, you know, specificity doesn't bother over here, or priority doesn't bother over here because they are two different elements. Now, if I should be applying color, and now say this color should be blue, all right, then let me close this. Now you realize that the blue is overriding the red, and it is happening because we are using what a class over here. So it means the class will always beat the element. The class is stronger than the element. I hope you're getting it. Then when we come back and we say the ID main heading, when we say hashtag main underscore heading, then we apply a different value on the same property, and let's choose chat rules. All right. You realize that now this particular property, let me use a different color. This, all right. You realize that now the pink is also overriding the heading. Pink is stronger than what? Sorry, the ID, which is the hash, is stronger than the class. I hope you. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say over here. So we have element, then class, then what? ID. So the element works, but the class is greater than the element, and then the ID is also greater than what? Than the class. So basically, that is how it works. If you are applying the same property to the element, then the same property to the class will override the element. The ID will also override the class. I mean, you is your question answered?
Yes, please. So it means it only happens when
When
the
you are there is a
attributes are the
yeah,
same.
when you have the same attribute, when you have conflict of
Yes, please.
attributes, then that's going to happen. If not,
It
that's
doesn't matter.
very
All
good.
right. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Foley, you can ask your question.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Please, is it always advisable to use the class and the ID at the same time with the element, as in when you are styling it? Is it advisable to use
No,
all,
no,
or you
it's
can
not.
just use one?
Yeah, you can use one, and we usually use the classes for styling. You can use the IDs, but we usually don't do that. We usually use the IDs when we are selecting the elements in JavaScript to work with it. Hope you get it. So usually we go with the class, and it's also going to help you to write a dry code, or it'll help you to not repeat yourself, because as we have seen earlier, you cannot apply the same ID to two different elements. So if you style an element and you are using the ID, if you have to apply the same style to another element and you are still going to use the ID, then it means you have to write that code again. However, as we have seen over here, we added where did I apply a class attribute? All right, so this title over here. So let me, because this is also another class, so this is going to override it. Let me take this out. Let me bring this up again. All right, so you can see. Okay, so let me take this out. And then on the title element, you realize that we have a title over here, and an H1 element in our code. This, and we have given it a class of what? Title. All right, and we applied a font family of Korean. Sorry, the title, we applied a color of brown to it, and you can see the brown showing over there. Then we came down. Then we had another H2 element which we've given the same class. And so when we come here, you realize the H2 element also has the same color. All right. So instead of giving them different IDs and selecting all of them, we give all of them the same class. We apply the style on one, and any item that has that particular class of title is going to take whatever declarations we have made over here. Fully, I believe your question is answered. All right, so we shall proceed. And I think we looked at the cascade, we looked at selectors, we looked at specificity, we looked at inheritance, and then I think, yeah. So one more thing which we can look at is the universal selector. And when you apply any styling on the universal selector, it applies to all the elements that take up that property. Are you getting it? Now, not all properties apply to all elements. For example, I can have what, a section, all right? Then in my section, I say color. I think I've done this, right? Or let me introduce a new element. Let me bring a div, all right? Then save. Then I can select that div over here, div, and I can say color red. Now it's not happening because the div cannot have a color. The div can have a background color but not a color. All right. So since I'm applying this color on div, it's not going to show. However, any element that comes inside of div, which can take up a property of red, is going to inherit this color. So suppose I bring a paragraph over here and I save, you realize that the P is now what? It's showing. Are you getting? And there is this border. If you can remember, we applied a border to our P element somewhere here. And so that's why it is showing. Okay, and so there is a red here, all right? So let me just comment this so that we don't get confused. All right, so you realize that what? Since this is overriding, sorry, this color has been applied on the div doesn't take a color. Any item that inherits that can take this property, it's now going to inherit it from the parent. And so basically, that is how this works. What I wanted us to focus on is the universal selector. And the universal selector, when you apply settings to the universal selector, any item that that particular style applies to, it's going to be affected by it. Are you getting it? So I can say font family of poppins, all right, and give it a fallback of sans serif. Great. And let me see what happens over here. Now you realize that my fonts have changed. Some of the fonts have changed, and I don't have Poppins font selected over here. I don't have Poppins font on my machine. Let me see if I have. I think I have Fira code. So let me use Fira code. Great. So this is Fira code, and I have Fira code over here, right? So you realize that all the text elements coming up are using what? Fira code, except those that I have specifically overwritten, because you realize that with the heading element, I've given it what? A font family of Korean, so it's slightly different. Let me change this to Times New Roman. All right, so just as it's shown. So if I haven't specified a style, a font family for each one, it's also going to take a Fira code, just like any of them. So that's how we apply root styling. So I can just say padding and give it a padding of 0, and none of the elements are going to be having what padding. And I can say margin, give it a margin of 0, and no element is going to be having what, a margin. Are you getting it? However, this universal styling can always be overridden by selecting a particular item. For example, I can come to this title over here and then give it a padding of 20 pixels, and it's affecting it over here. All right, so that's one thing about the universal selector. Moving forward, we'll be using it a lot more, and so you understand what role that plays a lot better. I don't know if anybody has any confusion so far, so we clear it and then we move on. The next thing we are going to be looking at is CSS colors and CSS. And let me clear whatever we have so far. All right, and bring in a paragraph and say lorem. And I have lorem here, and let me clear my styling and here. All right, so Before I jump on to whatever we're going to do with colors, one thing you should know is CSS has some sorry, browsers have some default properties which are applied to elements. And as we go on and we look at them, we'll be looking at what are the default properties for each of these elements. Erasmus, kindly get a mic on mute. I think there is some background noise from your end. And so by default, colors on in CS, when you're working with CSS or in a browser, colors are black by default. Background colors are white by default. Also, let's say most of them are transparent or inherited, right? So that when we look at the paragraph element, what we can do, let's say we want to apply a style. So we have, let me calm down a little bit, then give it a color. Then let's say color of black. All right, and nothing happens because that's the default. And we give it a color of red, and it's going to change. All right, now there are several ways by which we can declare colors in CSS, and by using the name of the color, that's one of them. The name of the color: red, blue, green, yellow, violet, and whatever. Then another is by using the hex property or the hex code or the hexadecimal code. Is that what it's called? But it's called a hex code, right? And it's a set of 6 characters which represent the colors. There are a lot more colors than there are color names. And so if you want to depend on color names, you're going to be limited to your choice of colors. However, with the hex code, you're going to be able to define a lot more colors, and you have a lot more variations of the same color in your code. And so for red, we can have F0000, and that is the color code or the hex code for the color red. All right. Then another property which we can also another way by which we can also declare a color is by using what the RGB properties or the red, green, blue. All right, so we can just come here and it takes values of red, values of blue, values of green. So we can come to RGB, right? And then so we have red, we have green, and we have blue, all right? And it's showing like this. And what we can do is we can control this over here. Something is happening and it's a little bit complex. All right, so let me just bring this here. What we can do is we can specify 255, which means we have the highest value of red. Then we have the highest value of green, which is 255. And then we have the highest value of blue, which is what, 255. And that becomes what? White. Are you getting it? That becomes white. So what we can uh, manipulate these colors to give you a better color if you desire, right? So we can have this here 200, and you can see the text is showing, but it's very faint. You can have this here 200, and it spans between 0 and what? And 255 for each of these properties. All right. So when you have 0 and you have 0 and you have 0, that's going to be black. All right. So you realize that you have a range of 255 on each of these. And so you have a lot more color combinations to play around with. All right. So let's have 150 here. Then we can have 50 here. And we have some, is it a violet or purple kind of color? I'm not so good with color names, to be honest. Then we can have 150 over here, and it's not making much of a difference, but there is some slight difference in it. Then another thing which we can do is there is another one which is the RGBA, and what that does it adds what an alpha channel which controls the luminosity of the colors. All right, so it spans from 1 to 0. When it's 0, your color is going to be what, completely transparent. it's going to be completely transparent. So it's there, but it can be seen. And then when I give it 0.5, that's the alpha channel. Sorry, when I say 0.5, that's going to give it about what? 50% transparency. And so that's the RGBA. That is what it does. Then another thing which we can do is use what? The HSL, or the hue, saturation, and what? Luminance or lightnings. All right. And it also takes up, let me bring this here. It also takes up what sets of values. And one thing which you can actually do in Visual Studio Code is while you have this select, when you hover over the color, you can click on the name of the color or the color code to switch between the modes, right? So I can click here to move to hexadecimal code. Then I click to go to what HSL, and it works in percentages, right? So the hue is basically about the color. We have the saturation, then we have what? The luminance, all right? So coming here, let's do something little over here. When I have this over here, you realize my hue is what? It's zero, because that's the color, that's red. Are you getting it? So if I change the color, or if I change the hue, you realize that the first element is what? Is changing, all right? And that's how it goes. And it spans from 0 to 360. It's usually, of color wheel, you have it round and it's pan. So that's the same thing. That's why it starts from red and ends at red. So it's in a range of 360. So you can move it anywhere to choose your desired color. And so that controls the hue. Then we have what? The saturation, which controls how dark it is. That's what the saturation. So you realize when we move it here, the saturation changes. And if we move it up and down, we have what? We are going to affect the luminance. Are you getting it? Let me bring this over here. We affect what? The luminance. So here you realize the luminance is at its highest, which is what? 100%. And then when it comes down, we have what? 0% for luminance. Great. And anybody having any questions about HSL? Then also, before any question comes up, the HSL also has the option to add what? The alpha channel. All right. Let me see how to get that on here. The HWB, RGB, no. Let me get the HSL. All right. And 0 and HSLA. Let me make it 1. And then with 1, we have our transparency at its highest, which is what? 100%. All right. If you want to have 0.8, we have our transparency slightly reduced. If you have zero point 0.2, a lower number, then your transparency it's going to be very faint, which you may hardly be able to read. So that's it basically about colors when it comes to CSS. All right. So what we can actually do is, let me wrap this in a parent, and let me have a div, right? And then I have a p paragraph element this in. Let me select my div and give it a background of brown, which is a nice color. Then I can select my paragraph. Something is wrong somewhere. I don't know why this keeps happening, but I think it's from one of the extensions I'm using in my Chrome browser. So let me paste this in my Firefox and see. All right, so this is how it's supposed to show. This is how it's supposed to show. So let me get rid of this for now. Now, right. So this is how this is supposed to show. We have the parent div having a background, and because we haven't specified a color for our paragraph, it's taking the default color, which is red. Then let me come here, pick my paragraph, and give it a color of white smoke. Yeah, white smoke is it's also great. Then I can another thing which I can do is let me give this a little padding of 10 pixels. I think that's too much. 5 pixels should be okay over here. And yeah, so you realize that we have a very nice contrast. It's easy to read the text on um, this background, the color of white on this background. But how easy will it be to read something that shows like this? You'd realize that it will be a lot more difficult to read for a user to read a dark text on a relatively dark background, right? So we have something which we call contrast, and that's what the difference between two colors. How sharp or how different is this color from the other? How easy is it for somebody to read, right? So this we do say has what very good contrast. Then we say this has a very poor contrast. A poor contrast. It can still be readable, but it's a lot more difficult to read, especially when your user is farther away or when the text is relatively small. You may not be able to read it that fine. Great. So we're going to be looking at another tool, and it's about helping us to get the right contrast, right? So we'll be looking at another tool from colors.co. So there is this website called coolest.co, and it helps you to pick color palettes for your project. When we begin building projects, we'll be making use of this website as well. So we'll come back to it. But they have a tool which is the contrast checker or the contrast calculator. Where is it? Contrast checker. All right, so that's it right here, and it calculates the contrast between two different colors. If it's good, then you know that okay, you can apply something like that in your project. If it's not, then you don't. So we have a text color on a relatively lighter background, which we can see it's very readable, and it has a contrast of 8.2, which is great, right? Now, should we increase the contrast of the text, you realize that it reduces to 1.4, very poor. And so when you do something like this, you're going to be sucking your visitors away or the users of the website. You're going to be sending them away. And so it's not advisable to do this. So if you are wondering if two colors can be paired, can be used as a background and then a text color or a foreground, you can basically come to this tool. I'm gonna put a link in the chat box as well, so that you guys can access it. And you can just play around. You choose a color which you like, and then you see how well those colors can work, right? If the colors can work together, and this one has a specificity of 21 for black and white, which I think is the highest specificity you can get, and it has the highest contrast. By default, it's black on white. That's how we train, and it's very cool, right? Or let's say you have white on black, which also has a very good contrast. You can play around based on the colors that you choose. All right. And when we learn JavaScript and we start creating projects, we may build something like this, right? I have a couple of projects which we shall be building together, like a password generator. I believe most of you have used password generators before. You open the site, it generates a password for you. It generates a password for you, and then you can just copy and use it in your project. So we'll be building a similar project as we move along. This is one that I made some time ago. So you click on it, and then it keeps changing the passwords for you. This is just by the way. Let's focus on CSS. Um, where was I? I was here. All right. So I was talking about the color contrast, and you use it basically. You use it to see if it's matching enough. So if it's very good, it tells you, and it gives you more information. It says what good contrast for small text, that is text that is below 18 points, and it's very great for text for larger text. All right, above 18 points, for bold above 14 points. That's the size of the text. And if you're working and it has it's good for large text but not good for small text, realize, say, let's do this. Let's copy this color code, and in our project folder, let's give this to the text. Then the paragraph, the background, sorry, what we have over here, let's copy this and then bring this here. So I'm lost. Okay, so this is where I was supposed to be. So you realize that this is relatively easier to read, right? Suppose let's zoom out to the font. You realize that this can be read, but it's not that easy to read as the other one. All right. So uh, Coolest is telling us that when your text is small, it may not be easy to read, but when your text is large, this is great. So you should always try to get a contrast that is good for both small text and large text as well, because when building projects, you really want to be switching between different color shades. You want to ensure consistency, and so you pay attention to that as well. So far, do we have any question, anything confusing, anything which you don't understand that we need to address before we move on? All right, so if no questions, we'll move on to look at the very last thing which we have planned for today. We'll look at the very last thing which we have planned for today, and we'll be looking at CSS units. CSS units. So units and CSS are just like we have units. We use units of measure for measurement in our daily lives. We have centimeters, we have meters, we have millimeters, and a whole lot of other ones, right? Let me just quickly jump onto the Mozilla Developer Network. They have a nice documentation, and we're going to be looking at some of those values. We'll be looking at absolute units and then relative units. I think somebody asked a question concerning this a while back, so today we are here. We'll be looking at it. So let me scroll down, and yeah, so down on numbers, lengths, and percentages, we have one unit which is a percentage. We'll look at it later, but let's come on to absolute lengths, and we have centimeters, which is equal to 37.8 pixels, which is equal to 25.2 over 64 inches. That's fraction to handle over there. We have millimeters, we have quarter millimeters and inches, we have pickers, we have points, we have pixels, right? And the only absolute unit we are going to be using throughout our web development career will be the pixels. There are some instances where you may want to use an absolute unit like a point or centimeters. And one instance which I used centimeter was when I was developing a portal, right? After filling the form, just like you have your passport application, after you fill the form, you print the summary, right? So the summary is going to be printed on a A4 sheet, which is a fixed size. So I decided to use millimeters to define the size of the web page, which is fine. You can do it in such an instance. But for displaying the main web page, you shouldn't go in for absolute units because it's we'll see the impact on it very soon. We'll see the impact on absolute units. So the only absolute unit we'll be using is the pixels, right? We'll be using the pixels for absolute units. Then when we move down, we have what relative units, and the relative units we have what the EM or the element size, and it says what is relative to the font size of the parent. In the case of typographical properties like font size and font size of what the element itself. In case of other properties like what the width. I don't know if anybody understands that. But then we also have the EX, which is the X height of the element font. We won't be using that. But we have the character, and then we will be using the character as well. And the advanced measure width of the glyph zero of the element font. Then we having the rem, which is the font size of the root element. Then there's the LH, which is the line height. We wouldn't be using that. And then we have the RLH, which is line height of the root element. Then we have the view width or the viewport width, which we'll be looking at as well. We'll have the viewport height, the vmin, but we'll just be focusing on our focus will be on EMs, will be on characters, will be on rem. Then we'll look at the view width and view height. We'll look at the dynamic viewports height and then the dynamic viewport width, right? So let me come back straight into my folder, my project over here, and then let me have this here. And then I have a paragraph, right? Then I have my dummy text over there. Great. So I did mention that browsers have default values, and the default size for a paragraph element is font size 12. Uh, Let me bring in my Word font plugin. When I hover over this, you realize that it's giving me the name of the font. But when I click on it, it's telling me that the font size is what 16 pixels. All right, it's showing me the font size to be 16 pixels, which is the default font size for the paragraph element. As you have seen, our style sheet is clear. I haven't defined any font size. So when I come here, I can say font size and say 16 pixels. All right. Oh, sorry, I pressed I instead. 16 pixels, and nothing happens because it's already 16 by default. Now, what I can do is make it 18 pixels, and we'll see a slight shift in the size. If I should make it 32, now it's twice that particular size. So that is what the pixel are, and they are the pixel, as we did say, it's an what? It's an absolute unit. It's not relative to any other units. Then we have, let me comment this, let me copy that here, then get this out. So we have another unit, which is the RAM, all right, the RAM unit, or sorry, font size, and we say one RAM, and one RAM it's 16 pixels as well. And the RAM here means what? Root element. I get it. That's the default set by the browser. I hope you guys get it. And so when we say if the default set by the browser is 2 RAM, we can say 2 rem, and that's going to be 32 pixels. So if I should, let me maximize this. Yeah, click on this, and it's now 32 pixels because the default is what is 2 rem. Now let me exit this, and then we have another unit called the em, or the element itself. Are you getting it? And you're going to ask yourself, what's the difference between the element and then the root element? Are you getting it? Now, the root element is making reference to the root property, the root value which is set by the browser, or a value that is set what by the parent. Now, the element refers to what the value set by a parent or the element itself. Now let's do some demonstration over here, right? We have this which we say what we want it to be 2m. Are you getting it? Now let me come here. Let me put this in a section. All right. Then I can define my section, and I can say font size of 16 pixels, right? I can say font size of what 16 pixels. Are you getting it? Now, what I'm saying is, what because we are working on the font size property. Now, this element is now what going to pick the font size of its parent. Are you getting it? If I bring, let me make this 32, and we are going to see. We will see the difference happening right now. If I should make this 2 rem, you see that 2 rem is taking what the size of the root element. The root element is that of the browser. Are you getting it? And the browser's default is what is 16. So since the browser's default is 16, let me make this rather a little smaller and this bigger. Great. Now the browser's default is 16. So now I says what 2 of the root element. 16 times 2 becomes what 32. Now let's check if we are learning something correct over here. We check this and it says what the font size is what is 32. Are you getting it? But the parent element is already 32 pixels. So when I'm using em, it's now going to pick what the size of its parent element and then multiply it by 2, and the parent element is already 32. So when it picks that and it multiplies by 2, we now have what a font size of 64, and that is what is showing over here. I believe you guys see the difference between what the em and then the rem. So when you use the rem, it's now going straight to the root element. The em is going to look for what a size applied to the parent element. If a size wasn't applied from the parent element, then that is going to inherit it back to what to the root element. Are you getting it? So let me change this here, and you realize this comes back to what 16, because this section wasn't given a style, so it's going to default to 16. But the moment a size has been applied to this particular element, you realize that this now takes the em goes what to that. And what we saw on the Mozilla Developer Network, looking at the em, it did mention that the font size of the parent. So the em is what when you say one em, it's going to pick one of what the font size of the parent element. That is, if in the case that this particular property we are assigning, it's a typographical property. Typographical property means it's being applied to typography. That is writing. So font size, font color, or whatever, those are typographical properties. So since the size here is being applied to the font size, then it's going to what take the size of what the parent element. Are you getting it? Now let me do something else. Let's give this a background. Please, if you're getting confused along the way, kindly prompt me. This is not supposed to be difficult. So if by virtue of the way I'm explaining it and you are confused, kindly alert me so that I can I want to make sure that so long as you are in this meeting, you should be attended to. You should benefit from it. All right. So if you are getting confused, just let me. Let me give this a background of black, and then give it a color of white. And let's see what's happening over here, right? So let me just do something real quick and do something we call CSS research. So padding 0, margin 0, then box sizing. Let me do it a border box. Then let me come here. All right. So focus is primarily on this paragraph text. Are you getting it? Now MDN said something. It is relative to the font size of the parent. That is, if we are working with what typographical properties like font size. But in an instance where we are not working with typographical properties, maybe we are working on a width or padding or any other property which is not applied typographic or typically to the font, then it's now going to relate to the size of that particular element or the font itself and not the parent property. So, oh shit, let me bring this back here. Looking here, we have what? Because we are applying font size, we are using the EM unit. Is now relating to what? Whatever has been applied to what? The section. This is one EM. So it's now relating to what? Whatever has been applied to each parent, which is what? The section. Then, if we come here and we say padding, all right, and we say padding, let's say 0.5 em, and we save. Now this padding is not going to what? Pick from the 32 pixels. It's going to pick from what? The 1 em. I getting it. So let me make this 2 em. All right. So our padding is what now? Sorry, the font size for the paragraph is 2 em. It's picking two times the size of what has been defined in the parent. So this is what? 32. Let me check once again to make sure we are doing the right thing. Sorry, 64. This is 32. So 2 of 32 will give you 64. And that is it. Now, this padding is also EM, but it's not going to pick from the parent. It's now coming to pick from what? The font size itself. Are you getting it? So the font size over here is what? 2 EM. 2 times 32 is what? 64. So the font size is 64. Kindly put that in mind. You have a font size of what? 64. Now the padding we say the padding what? Take from this instead of this. So 0.5 of 2. Sorry, this is what? 64. So 0.5 of 64, that is half of 64, should give you what? 32. So the padding which is applied over here, and padding is actually space within an element. All right, we'll be looking at paddings and margins later on. So when I use the CSS paper and I check, you realize that it's showing me a padding of what? 32 over here. I hope you are getting it. So first of all, this picked what? The 32 and multiplied it by 2, giving 64, and this takes half of the 64, which becomes 32 again. So let me just make this 3, right? And then this now becomes 3 times 32 should give us 96, right? So our font size is now what? 96. Then the padding of 0.5 em now goes back to take from the font size of 96 and divides it into half. Half of 96 is 48. So you realize that my padding over here is showing what? 96 pixels. I believe you guys understand the difference between the root element and then the em. Should I come back here and make this 0.5 rem? It's not going to take from this again. I get it. It's now going to take from the root property for the browser. I getting it. So let me refresh my page. This is now 0.5 rem, and then no, let me use the CSS paper instead. And you realize that the padding is now what? 8. Are you getting it? 0.5 of 16. The root element is always 16 for the browser. So since that one is 16, you realize that the padding becomes what? 8. So the root element and then the element itself, that's the difference between it. If nobody is confused, let me show another demonstration. Now, it's not advisable to go with the EM when you're building web pages because it can get confusing. For example, you apply a particular property on a parent element, it's going to affect the child element. And in an instance where that's not what you intend to, it can be quite confusing. It can be quite confusing. So it's advised that you go with what? The rem or the relative element or the root element, sorry, the root element. And that's how it's going to go. We don't go with, don't, when you are defining font sizes, don't go with pixels. All right. Don't go with pixels. Why? Let me show you why. Um, Let me get back here and make this one rem, which is 16 pixels. All right. And then let me take, remove this for now. No. All right. So let me just have this as this. Then let me say 1 px. Sorry, I'm giving this. Oh, sorry, 16 pixels. I'm going crazy. Let me go to settings. Then appearance. Let me change my font size for my browser and make it what? Very large. And I believe you can see that the text on the MDN network has what? Has increased very much, very well. Are you getting? Whatever it is that is on the MDN network has increased. The text has increased. When I come here, you let me see if I've applied any. All right, so I've applied an absolute. Let me duplicate this. Let me bring a line break over here, and this rather. Let me give it a class of P2, shape paragraph 2. All right. Then when I come here, I'll just say paragraph 2 and give it a font size of what? 1 rem. Are you getting it? Now remember that we said 1 rem is equal to 16 pixels. That is the default. 1 rem is 16 pixels. Now I've given an absolute figure to what? My first paragraph, right? Which is 16 pixels. And I've given a relative unit of 1 rem, which is also supposed to be 16 pixels, but it's appearing bigger. And the reason we advise that you go for relative unit is to help in assistive technology or to make your website accessible, to make it's simple for everyone to what to use your website. So we have people who I think we have the short-sightedness and then the long-sightedness. People can't see things that are big, all right, so they want to make it small. There are some people who also can't see when it's small, and so they want to make it big. So they go into their browser and then they make everything very large, so that when they come onto your website, everything should appear big for them. Are you getting it? The bad side of pixel is that when you use pixel and somebody like that comes onto your website, the thing is going to stay at 16 pixels, which is not going to be good for them. I hope you get it. But if you use the rem, the root element, which is a relative unit, it's going to be what? A little bigger for them to see. I hope you get a difference. So don't use instead of using 32 pixels, use 2 rem. It's going to come as 32 pixels. But for anybody who has eye problems or who wants their text to appear big, then you are going to serve them their size. So accessibility is very key. There's absolutely no use in creating a product where your end users begin get to face challenges with. So basically, that's why people recommend using the RAM over the pixels. I believe I've answered a question which was asked last week. If you can remember, somebody asked that question. So now the question has been answered. If nobody is confused so far, we'll continue. And we'll be looking at, yeah, Shamil, it was Shamil who asked that question. Thank you for reminding me. Your hand is raised. You can ask your question, please.
All right, thank you, sir. But I wanted to ask, is it okay to make the parent element, you give the distance, the font size a rem attribute, sorry, a rem distance size?
The parent element. So if you give the parent element a rem size, then it's also going to be fetching from what? The root element. And if you give the parent element a root size, maybe a rem, say, let's come here. Let's say we give section of 2 rem, right? Which is going to be 32 pixels. And then the user comes for with assistive changes their display size to very large, then it's going to affect it for them. I getting it, and it's going to affect this. If this particular unit is fetching from this, then this is going to be affected as well. I getting it. So imagine we say 1 em, or let's say 0.5 em. You realize that it is also bigger now. I get it because this is 2 rem and it's now becoming bigger. Let's say 32 pixels for the user. So half of that is going to be 16. This is not supposed to be 16, but that's the calculation, right? 2 rem, it's 2 rem, right? Let me see. Let me change this back to 1 rem. We know that by default 1 rem is 16 pixels, right? So I think, right, so this is 16 pixels. Now let me change this to large and see. So this is 20 pixels. So when the user puts it on large, the root size becomes 20 pixels. And then when the user puts it on extra large, the root size becomes 24 pixels, right? So if we put this on 1 rem, which is 24 pixels, instead of it being 16 pixels, when the user increases it, it becomes what, 24 pixels for the user. And so half of 24 pixels, when we have what, 0.5 em over here, that's going to be what, half of 24 pixels, which will be 12 pixels. And as you can see, it's showing very small over here. So when we bring our checker, you realize the font size is what, 12 pixels, which is um, very small, right? So in most cases, you don't want to define a size on the parent element because all of your elements, it is advised that they fetch from the root element. So just work with the root element. Everybody goes to the parent source, and that's it. If you want it, go. It's like I've gone for mine. If you want you to go for yours, you don't fetch from me. That's basically how it's advised to go with. It's your question answered, Shamil.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Right, well, you're welcome. Then we'll proceed and we will look at some other attributes as well, some other units as well. So we now saw pixel, we saw rem, and we saw the em. The next we are going to be looking at is percentage, right? And suppose we come onto this particular or h1, right? We have an h1 over there. So when we select our h1 and we say a width, we can say we can give it a width of 500 pixels, right? And nothing is showing. Let's give it a background so that we can see the effect. A background of blue. And when we come here, you realize that it's going to span between what, 500 pixels. If you want to do the calculation, I have a CSS viewer, a ruler over here, and I can calculate, and it's showing what, 500 pixels to the very end. Right, if you measure it well, you would see the 500 pixels. Let me just take that off, and that's it. So another unit which we can do is we can use the percentages, right? And instead of giving it 500 pixels, I'm going to give it the extension is ruler. Is this CSS ruler? Page ruler. The extension is page ruler for Chrome. I don't know the variants there will be for the other platforms. Page ruler. I'm putting the name of that extension in the chat box. Page ruler, so you can check it out later. Now, when I say 50%, I give it what, 50%, and percentage always applies to what, the size of the parent element relative to what, the parent element. Are you getting it? So the parent element over here is what? It's a section. Are you getting it? And by default, the section is a block element. Block elements take all of the page. I hope you get it. So when we have a paragraph is a block element, you realize that after we apply the background, it has taken all of the page from left to right. And so it means that the 50% which we have applied, it's going to take what? 50% of the size which we have applied for the section, which is the parent element. And the section in this instance is what? 100%. So it's going to take what? 50% of that size. All right, we can say 100%, and it's going to take everything. All right, and for block elements, when you want to give it a weight of 100%, just don't bring it, because by default they have a weight of what, of 100%. So you realize that I've taken the weight off, and it's still showing what, 100%. So block elements, you don't need to specify the weight if it's going to be 100%. What can also happen is, let me bring back the weight and make it what, 50%. All right, let me cancel this. Let me make the weight a weight of 50%. Then go back to what, the section, and give the section a width. Sorry, not a word wrap. A width of 100%, right? And nothing is happening because it's already 100% by default. Let me give that a background color of red. So realize our section is taking the whole page. Great. So I can just define the width for my section and make that one what? 500 pixels, right? So it's 1005. I wanted it to be 500. So the width is of my section is now 500 pixels, which is spanning from here to here. Are you getting it? Then you realize that the H1, which is a child of what, the section, we've given it a weight of what, 50%. So it now takes 50% of what, the 500 pixels, because all that the section is taking is 500. So whatever is here will always be relative to the parent. When we increase the parent, this is also going to increase. Let's use the page ruler and see page ruler. So I'm mentioning this to here, and that is 500 pixels, as you can see over here. Let me put it there. That's 500 pixels. Then when we measure for the blue element, it's showing 200 and, where am I? 500. So it's supposed to show what, 250. All right, I think I've got it now. All right, great. So at the very end over there, it's what, 250 pixels. So that's how the percentage works. It's always relative to the parent element. That's it about percentages. And we don't use percentages when we are applying fonts to we are applying sizes on fonts. For the font sizes, it can work, but it's not advisable, right? You can say 100%, and it's going to be 100% of the root element, like 2 rem. And when you say 200%, that's going to be 2 rem. So it's the same thing. 100% and rem are the same. in this particular instance. So let me make this 2 rem, and then we go on. Then another unit which we have, I think we are 5 minutes away. So let me just mention the unit real quick so that we don't spend more time than we have intended to. We have another unit called the viewport width and then the viewport height. All right, and so the white space over here. Now, when you look at my browser, after the bookmarks over here, everything over here. Let me just remove everything from here. All right, then let me clear everything again, or let me style my body and then say background black, make it red. Great. So the red area you are seeing over here becomes what? My viewport height. That is from top to down, or the viewport. The red area you are seeing is the viewport. And then from left to right, it becomes the viewport width. Are you getting it? Then from top to the edge over the down here is what? The viewport height. That is, the viewport is basically the screen area where the website is being displayed for the user. So when I have something like this, from here to here becomes what? The viewport width, and then from top to the bottom becomes what? The viewport height. So how does the viewport height or the viewport width works? Let me remove this over here, and then let me bring in a section, or let me bring in just a div, right? Great. Then with my div, let me give it a class because I realized the extension I'm using, the live server, has also a div property and it's affecting my background. That's why I had to go use the Mozilla earlier. So let me give it a class of container. Then let me save. Then when I come here, I can just style my container and then say width, and then I can say 100 viewport width. Are you getting it? So it's going to mean 100% of this available area. The viewport width is basically going to be what? 100% of the available space area from left to right. That's the viewport width. And then the viewport height is going to be from here to here. So let me bring this here. Then I say 100 viewport width. Let me give the div a background of red. All right, and it doesn't have a height. Okay, so let me give it a height of 50 pixels, and then we can see it now. So you can realize that it's taking the whole area. I get it. So when I say 50 viewport width, it's going to simply be 50% of the viewport. So one viewport width is 1% of what? The area. So when you use percentage, it's applying to what? The parent property. Are you getting it? But when you use viewport, it's applying to the viewport. So in most cases, if you haven't defined a fixed value or a fixed size for the parent, then the viewport width is going to be the same as percentage. But in an instance where you've given a size to the parent element, then it's going to be different from what? The viewport width. And so I can also say 100 viewport height, that is 100 VH, right? I save, and this is covering the viewport height. So you realize that I can scroll past it. And when I scroll past it, now I have something else because this is supposed to take what? Just the viewport height. So when I scroll above that, it's ending over here. That's the space. All right. Should I minimize my browser? You may think that, okay, since I'm minimizing my browser, some of it is hidden so I can get it. But the moment I scroll, it becomes very small. So it's only going to what? Pick the size of the available area, viewing area for the user. So that's basically about what? The viewport height. And the same thing happens with what? The viewport width. Then let me just look quickly at another one, which is called the dynamic viewport width. And for that, we are past our closing time. But if you guys should pardon me, I just want to conclude on I want to conclude the lesson on units so that tomorrow we can look at another thing. So let me see if I can bring my mobile screen onto the desktop. Let me see. And the reason for the dynamic viewport width or height, it's basically for mobile devices. All right. Most of you, if you're on mobile, you'd realize that a user visits you visit a web page, and then when the moment you begin to scroll, the address bar will get hidden. You won't see the address bar again. So when the address bar is showing, that's the viewport. Whatever it's, let me just bring the screen here and so I want to open the page on my phone so that we see what we are doing. All right, so my screen is showing now, and as you can see, my mobile, um, you see that the address bar is showing over here, right? The address bar is showing with the IP and then the port number. Now, the moment I begin to scroll, you realize that the address bar gets hidden. So now my viewport height has changed. Now, this is the viewport height from this side to this side. The address bar is non part. But the moment I start scrolling, now the viewport height has changed. So we realize that the container is not touching the bottom again because the viewport height has changed. So that's the reason we use the dynamic viewport height, right? So let me come back into my code. Then let me make this DVH. Save. Then let me go back into my code. Let me comment this line breaks so that it doesn't affect it over here. All right. Now let me bring a paragraph over here, right? And say something. Great. So I now have my viewport, and then I scroll. Let me write something a lot more lengthy so that we can see the effects. Great. So I have my viewport height from here to here, and then I scroll, right? You realize that I've now scrolled and the browser is not showing any, sorry, the address bar is not showing anymore, but still the container is filling the whole screen. All right, until I scroll past it again. All right, so let me go back. Let me change this to what? Just the viewport height. Let me save. And you realize that the moment I scroll past it, this one shows. When I scroll this, the moment this one goes, this one shows. But then if I make it the dynamic viewport height, if I scroll, you see that it pushes the text down. Now the viewport height increases. But I scroll again and this comes. I don't know if you guys can see the effect. Let me refresh the page. Let me scroll and this happens. With the viewport height, I scroll and it goes. Dynamic viewport height, I scroll and it pushes it down. Then when I scroll, it now goes. So the first scrolling, it means the viewport has changed. So it's going to recalculate and take the full space available again. So that's it for CSS units. When we begin building projects, moving on, we'll be using them. So I believe when we get to apply them, you understand why we are bringing them. Anybody having questions so far? Anybody having questions? Anybody confused? Anybody not understanding anything? Okay, so thank you very much for making time and staying throughout today's lesson. I'm going to be uploading the recording onto YouTube so that if you need to make any reference, you can go back to it. And should there be any assignments, I'll post it in the group as well. Thank you very much for um, staying. Have a good evening, you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.